Hello, I'm Preti Taneja, and welcome to this short reflection on using objects and testimony in your short stories, particularly as a way to think and talk about huge world events. Naturally, I'm going to be talking about time and memory and feelings, about familiarity and defamiliarity, the ways in which things can be used in writing to make the everyday strange and cast the world in a different light. So, I might be touching on difficult subjects, but that's the nature of memory and storytelling, and perhaps one of the first functions of objects in stories in this context. They help us to focus on fierce emotions, unruly desires, and vast politics through a very narrow prism. They help us to stay grounded in the sensory aspects of the material world that surrounds us, often allowing us to process our characters' thoughts and feelings, backstories, and even politics and material culture itself. They help us to grasp the old story writing adage that it's better to show, not tell. In short, using intimate, everyday, or even strange objects to think with and through huge world events, from the Indian partition in 1947, for example, to the current pandemic, allows us to use the object to tell the story for us. Think of being at school when you might have been asked to bring an object in and show it to the class and tell the story of it. What was the function of that exercise? To show your peers and your teacher, your early readers, as it were, how to understand you and your world. You may have been the child who brought in something meaningful, old or new. Or you might have chosen to bring in something mundane, without deep meaning to you, a penny, a button, a spool of thread, and used it to unravel a cultural history or make a comment on what mattered or didn't matter materially in your life. Whatever your approach was, this exercise opens a space for imagination and the fusion of feeling and history, personal and political, with a thing in itself. Using objects is all the more powerful when you concentrate on them. As writers, I think we have to train our eyes and our other senses to specificity to make the most of the language at our disposal. A good beginning exercise is to take the nearest object in reach, give yourself a time limit, and write down a list of words describing it without actually naming it. Don't think too much, but write about its weight and texture, its colors, its smell or taste. Now describe its function. You might surprise yourself with how much feeling goes into a paragraph like this. You might find a story begins to surround the object. You might give it consciousness, even. It might begin to speak for itself, or at least act as correlative for a set of memories and feelings you have about it. You might find that even the most mundane object suddenly begins to represent a whole history and set of memories you haven't thought about for years, or that you always think about every time you look at it, though never quite consciously. This can be an unlocking exercise, so it's important to take care. Though this is supposed to be a short story masterclass, I'm loath to define the form and its strange power and potential beyond length, which itself is negotiable. Shorter than a novella, longer than a word. An object poem can be a short story. For example, Philip Larkin's musings in Love Songs in Age, which considers love and its bright myths through the importance of old records to a bourgeois woman in the 1950s. Or another of his works, Home is So Sad, which amasses objects, the music on the piano stool, that vase, to think through why we hold on to things at all. A short story can be constructed as prose poem, as in the work of one of my favorite such writers, Singaporean prose poet Alvin Pang. In his work, Other Things, he writes, other things mean other things. And it's a good rule of thumb when thinking about objects in our stories. He reminds us that a cooking pot asks the difficult questions: what will burn, and how long, and to what end? The thing becomes the metaphor for thinking about time. Pang's approach builds more concretely on how objects can be deconstructed to make an uncategorizable text. For example, in the work of modernist Gertrude Stein, her seminal work, Tender Buttons, has been called the fullest realization of the turn to language and the most perfect realization of wordness, where word and object merge. It's worth reading, often, for fierce and philosophical reverie on how language creates things and things make world meaning. To give some quotes, Stein writes, "The time when there are four choices, and there are four choices in a difference. The time when there are four choices, there are kind, and there is a kind. There is a kind. There is a kind. Suppose there is a bone. Supposing there are bones. There are bones. When there are bones, there is no supposing there are bones. There are bones, and there is that consuming. The kindly way to feel separating is to have space between. This shows a likeness." For anyone thinking about family proximity or distance, what makes a community and what makes communal violence, about separation or intimacy, and how it can make us friends or enemies in troubled times, Stein's focus on bones as objects provides a salve. In this short extract, I read a timely reminder through repetition and focus, the slippery nature of emotive punning language in the word kindness, and irrefutable fact that even if we have four choices, of identity, for example, we all have bones via her use of associative words. Another of Stein's short object poems goes, "There is no use at all in smell, in taste, in teeth, in toast, in anything. There is no use at all, and the respect is mutual." Taking this example also, it's clear that considering objects as a way to think through our relationship to the world can imbue a sense of serious humour and the absurd into our writing. This is no small thing, especially when we're dealing with complex and intimate emotions such as grief, love, nostalgia, or loss precipitated by world events. Think of going for a walk, which for many has been the only possibility of recreation for all the last long months. Think of hope as objects. Stein might write it so: hope in gates, hope in spoons, hope in doors, hope in tables, no hope in daintiness and determination, hope in dates. Her distillation allows us to read anything we like into it, taking the pandemic lockdowns as example. Gates and spoons and doors and tables provide us with a sense of opening up to gatherings again. No hope in daintiness or determination comments on how we fear what we can't categorize. Hope in dates, well, we're all looking forward. Stein's mastery provides short story writers with a particular way of using language and objects to think through the complexity of our world in an extremely condensed way. But what about more traditional takes on the story form? For this, I think it's useful to return to nonfiction writers and curators to help us understand how objects can function in our work. For this, I'm going to think about history close to my own heart, the history of the Indian partition in 1947, which my own grandparents lived through. As a young married couple, they left their house in Lahore, in what is now Pakistan, and joined the great migration of people to a modest dwelling in Delhi, leaving behind almost everything they owned. My grandmother, like many of that generation, never fully recovered from those losses of family and community, and objects became more meaningful to her because of it. In her book, Remnants of a Separation, A History of the Partition Through Material Objects, Anchal Malhotra gathers the memories of that generation in India and Pakistan through the objects they brought with them across the Radcliffe Line that divided the subcontinent into India, Pakistan, and what later became Bangladesh. Her work allows us to access the vast history of that time through the people who lived through it. I think this is important. Too often, when the huge world events take place, we think our own stories cannot matter to the public, in the public domain, because everyone is experiencing something, and sometimes we think it's worse than what we are going through. On the contrary, it's often the most intimate consideration of the smallest things: a necklace, a shell collected on a beach, even a pair of running shoes you thought you'd never wear but have now worn out could tell the story of your lockdown and speak to someone else about theirs. An interesting discussion happening in museums at the moment is what objects from the time of this pandemic should be preserved to tell the material story of the emotions of this time. The face mask, the hand sanitizer, the hospital PPE kit are general ones, but each home, each individual will also have their own. Interviewing subjects is a way of researching fiction takes skill. Focusing around an object can make this a more shared, collaborative, and empathetic process. Fiction writers can learn perhaps from oral historians in this regard. In simple terms, objects can be portals, as the designer Alexis Lloyd writes, totems or touchstones to draw you into a story, to transport you to another time or place through the locus of that object, lenses through which to look backward in time, to tell a story about our own histories or the histories of your environments. They can collapse space, bringing your character closer to another from another period, or in a distant country, or even in the next room. They can access difficult memories and emotions for our characters, as visitors to memorial museums will attest. Objects can be subjects. You can imbue them with character and a changing nature and make them speak, allowing your story to tell a different perspective on the sweep of history. A pencil passed between different writers across a century, for example, might write the story of that time from 4 different points of view, depending on the hand holding it. But objects, of course, belong most commonly in the backgrounds of our stories, as time or space markers, as revelations of characters, the kind of soap, for example, that a character might use. The smell of it on their skin leads to thinking about the moment of production of that soap in history. Was it of a particular moment in your character's life, or in the life of someone they knew and loved, or hated, or both? Background objects can provide a portal for the reader's imagination and a connecting or revealing point into your text. To work with objects as foregrounded or backgrounded in stories, it's helpful to begin with similar questions as you might when you build character. What story do you want this object to tell? What is its relationship with your main story as a whole? How significant is the object and where you position it, and how you return to it in the text? And what do you, as a writer, want it to signify? Perhaps desire, or its opposite, or both. What does it mean for an object to have a voice or a point of view? Do these objects have the potential to do the work of poetry, compress language to yield deeper meaning in the work? And what do they say about us as writers and our worldview that the reader might hold on to as they read? One thing I love about using objects is that they act as a good starting point to warm up to writing. Using them for short inspirational or motivational exercises can lead to full short story ideas, even novels. Melis de Caringal's Mend the Living is one example. The story of a heart as it's transplanted from one body to the next, and the people who come into contact with it on its journey provide us with a way of thinking about a sweep of lives and cultures through an object we all possess, the heart. Through this device, the author addresses our fears, just as writing itself does, of what it means to die and to be alive as the world around us takes its course.